All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on behalf of the George A. Smathers Libraries and the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. I would like to welcome you all to this talk titled Fight the Power, A History of the UF Student Activist Movement Since 1963, presented by Aron Ali-McClory. My name is Sarah Coates. I am the University Archivist here at the George A. Smathers Libraries. And I'd like to take a couple of minutes here to introduce you to Aron, to introduce you to the programs that have supported Aron's research, and also to discuss very briefly, I promise, the work that Aron has done on this particular research project. Aron Ali-McClory is a senior majoring in political science and anthropology, and they are graduating from UF this spring. Congratulations. They aspire to continue their research work in graduate school. Aron is also the co-founder of the UF chapter of the Young Democratic Socialists of America and serves as one of the two national co-chairs for that same organization. They have also served as a College of Liberal Arts and Sciences senator for student government, and they have also worked on political campaigns at the local, state, and federal level. I personally have had the pleasure and honor of serving as Aron's mentor since the spring of 2024, when they were a member of the Smathers Library Discovery Fellowship cohort. They were conducting research on the UF student movement as part of their Discovery Fellowship. I had the pleasure to continue to serve as Aron's mentor this academic year as they were continuing their research on that UF student movement as one of the Graham Center's Askew Scholars. I would like to briefly mention the goals of these two important programs that are supportive of undergraduate research here at the University of Florida. The Smathers Libraries Discovery Fellowships are funded through the generosity of Joseph and Rebecca White. These fellowships provide students with a mentor in the Special and Area Studies Collections Department, and they allow students to explore materials in the collections here at the University of Florida. Their research culminates in a presentation of their research question and the exploration of their topic in Special and Area Studies collections. Any full-time undergraduate student at UF are encouraged to apply if they have an interest in using archives materials in their research. Applications for next spring's cohort will open in late fall of 2025. The Reuben Askew Scholars Program, offered through the Bob Graham Center for Public Services, supports undergraduate researchers selected for their commitment to public service and civic engagement. Scholars are supported with funding and faculty mentorship over the course of the academic year. Applicants from any undergraduate major in college at UF who have a minimum of a 3.0 GPA may apply. Unfortunately, the application period has just closed, but you can look for the opportunity when it reopens next spring. Aron's research work since the spring of 2024 has taken them through many collections held here in university archives. They've done deep dives into the presidential papers from many of our presidents here at the University of Florida. They've also done extensive work in the Vice President for Student Affairs records. They've also combed through the Alligator's newspaper, the Independent and Florida Alligator. They've explored our reference files that we have on various campus protests. They've read unpublished manuscripts. They have read lots and lots of things. All of these countless hours of reading and research have led to this presentation and a final paper. Now, before I turn this over to Aron, I do want to say a couple more things, and I'm going to get off the stage so that Aron can talk. I do want to say that the views expressed in this presentation are not representative of the University of Florida, the George A. Smathers Libraries, or the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. I do also want to let you know that this talk is being recorded right now. We are only going to record the talk, the actual presentation of this presentation, but we will have a Q&A session afterwards that will not be recorded. If you are joining us via Zoom, welcome. Thank you for coming. Please feel free to put your questions into the chat at any time, and we will try to get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. If you're here in person, please do hold your questions until the end, and we will be passing around microphones to allow you to present your questions to Aron. It has been an absolute joy and pleasure to guide Aron through the absolute mountains of archival collections that they've gone through since spring of 2024. They have done a lot of reading for their research to get to this final product that you all are about to hear about today. I do hope that through the course of this presentation that you come away with a deeper understanding of the student movements here at UF from this particular presentation. And with that, I will now turn this over to Aron. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. My name is Aron. I'm happy to be here with you today to discuss the history of protest and student activism on this historic University of Florida campus. Again, I would like to thank Sarah for the wonderful introduction and do truly want to emphasize that this would not be possible without the generous scholarships of the Discovery Fellowship and the Askew Scholars Program. And for that, I want to say an emphatic thank you. The student protest movement at UF has a long and storied history. For this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the history of the movement largely from the 1960s and 1970s, and also drawing out the lessons from that time period to the more modern protests that have happened on campus in the past 10 years. This research started in earnest in the spring of 2022 when I was still at my first year here at UF. In high school, as Sarah mentioned, I'd volunteered on political campaigns, but in college, I was excited to sink my teeth into deeper forms of activism. Long story short, I became a member of the Young Democratic Socialists of America chapter on campus and got involved in the activist scene here in Gainesville. Beyond the campus, I became involved with a couple of projects through the Civic Media Center. For those who don't know, an alternative library and activist space on South Main Street. On one occasion in the courtyard of the CMC, as we call it for short, I sat down with a man named Dan Harmeling, a veteran of the storied student movement of the 1960s, which in all honesty at that time, I didn't have much of a clue about beyond a documentary or two in a history class in high school. During our conversation, Mr. Harmeling, in the interest of preserving the legacy of that time at UF, gave to me a manuscript, which I have here, called Berkeley of the South, a history of the student movement from 1963 to 1968. Never published in full, Berkeley of the South is a half history, half memoir, written by Mr. Harmeling's mentor of sorts, Dr. Marshall B. Jones, a professor of psychiatry at UF who was controversially denied tenure in 1969. It would be a while before I took up reading Berkeley of the South seriously, and what I found when I did was a deep insight into how the student movement was born at UF, how it transformed and grew, the challenges it faced, and the successes that it won. Today, I'll be talking a lot about what's inside Berkeley of the South, but also talking beyond it too. After all, UF students didn't stop protesting in 1968 when Dr. Jones' history ends, and as I found, and as you might know, that same movement lives on at UF today. Now, a lot of what I'm writing is being compiled into a great big paper that with a dash of luck will be published for everyone to read. For this talk, though, I want to frame the history of protest at UF through a series of stories that encapsulate not only the mood of the time that these stories take place in, but also the relationships and dynamics between the student movement, the student body as a whole, and institutions at UF. These institutions might vary from story to story. In some, it might include student government. In others, it might be a vague allusion to administration as Tigert Hall. And in other cases, it might be specific bodies, such as the President's Office or the Board of Trustees, or as it was known prior to 2001, the Board of Regents. I understand these stories might leave some gaps in the overall timeline, and while I'll try to connect the dots as best I can, I'd be more than happy to answer more specific questions during the Q&A section after the main talk. And finally, over the course of this talk, I'll be referencing the term student movement. You might have seen this on graphics or flyers stylized as the student activist movement or the campus protests movement, but what I want to capture by using this term is the way in which students themselves are at the center of the movement. And even when specific topics become the focus of the movement, similar issues such as free speech, student rights, and in many cases left-wing politics all become centered in some way or another. Now that we've got that all out of the way, let's talk history. I want to start with some framing of what UF was like before the 1960s, at least politically, and set the stage for some of the first stories I'll tell. Prior to the 1960s, just simply the student movement didn't exist at the University of Florida or in Gainesville as it had on other campuses in their communities across the country. Outside of very limited student groups or isolated actions, little continuity existed between the student organizers who existed at UF before 1963 and those who existed after. Gainesville, and much of rural northern Florida, which surrounded the city, was a hotbed of Ku Klux Klan activity with frequent racial violence in nearby Jacksonville. The White Citizens Councils, a racist and pro-segregation group in Florida, was headquartered in Ocala, just 40 miles to the south. By all means, UF itself was regarded as, quote, a lethargic and conservative, end quote, campus when it came to movement politics. Coming into the 1960s, the height of 1950s Cold War hysteria swept Gainesville in the form of the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, colloquially known as the Johns Committee, which investigated suspected homosexual students and faculty on the basis of alleged communist sympathies from the 1950s to the early 1960s, although we really see the height of that in the early to mid 50s. Perhaps due to the repressive culture of surveillance and fear created by the Johns Committee, and perhaps due to the relatively calm atmosphere on campus at the time, throughout the 50s, UF exhibited a total lack of student activism and protest. Although there were major civil rights direct actions in Florida, such as the 1961 jail-in in Tallahassee that was led by Black students from Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, FAMU, since these actions mainly occurred at Black majority campuses and focused on racial issues, there is no such action until 1963 at UF, which, despite being situated in a town with thousands of Black citizens, had almost no Black students in 1960. Across the South, particularly on primarily white campuses, the vestiges of the civil rights movement never inflamed the student movement as it did on northern campuses. Simply put, with little interest, a chilling conservative atmosphere, and high amounts of repression, there are few active students and almost no organizational infrastructure from which a student movement could evolve. The lack of a majority Black campus in Gainesville meant that the strongest aspects of the Black-led student movement, which conducted sit-ins at lunch counters and other businesses to protest segregation across the South from 1960 to 1961, never reached UF. Despite this lack of activity during the early 1950s and early 60s, the student movement would eventually manifest itself in Gainesville. At the height of the civil rights movement in 1963, Gainesville saw increased student activity pertaining to desegregation efforts in the city, spurred by the junior chapter of the local National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. The establishment of a biracial committee by the city of Gainesville led to the desegregation of some segregated businesses, but not all. And ultimately, this desegregation movement in the city was met with venom and violence by white business owners and residents who did not like desegregation. The relative ineffectiveness of desegregation efforts and rising national tensions over civil rights in the summer of 1963 led students to join the fight in a way they hadn't up until now, by organizing. Marshall B. Jones describes this period during the mid-1960s of growing consciousness in Gainesville by saying, quote, "From 1963 to 1968, the movement in Gainesville was the only campus-based white movement in the South with a record of persistent and increasing radical activity," end quote. Jones' characterization of UF as the Berkeley of the South is particularly important because of the significance of the movement at Berkeley, which I'll talk about briefly. Growing from the local civil rights movement, the student movement at Berkeley emerged out of reaction to the suppression of what are called the Sproul Hall demonstrations in 1963 and 1964. This student movement, known as the Berkeley Free Speech Movement, constituted a shift from purely civil rights organizing to a broader and more ideological form of organizing recognized independently as the student movement. Jones alleges that this same shift happened in Gainesville, setting the UF student movement apart from many other primarily white movement formations in the South. This was, in effect, a concentrated turnover of student activists and organizers from civil rights to the broader arena of anti-war, anti-poverty, and later Black power, environmental, and feminist organizing. The first story I'm going to tell will be about the formation of the student movement at UF, and at first through an organization known as the Student Group for Equal Rights, or SCUR, as I'll be referring to it. SCUR was an organization formed in 1963. If you'll remember, I talked about the height of tensions at that time and local desegregation efforts stalling and students getting involved. And the way that students and faculty decided to get involved was by forming an organization known as SCUR. Now, the first action that SCUR took, and as is pictured here, is a picketing at college inn that lasted for the full fall semester of 1963, which was right off campus. This college inn was right off campus. You can imagine it's, if any of you are familiar with like Raising Cane's, it was probably right around there. And the owners of this college inn refused to desegregate even after extensive talks with SCUR, UF administration, and local Gainesville city officials. SCUR's decision to picket after the negotiations broke down was controversial because, again, this is not a campus or a community that was accustomed to protest, not the least from students or faculty. Due to this controversy, Tigert Hall, allegedly on behalf of the city's biracial committee, threatened action against SCUR. And while nothing would come of this threat, it does constitute the very first fault line between administration and student protesters. And one could say that this is the beginning of what would become a long-lasting alienation between student protesters and Tigert Hall. Where there was initial trust, remember, student protesters from SCUR, administration, and the local city officials had worked together on this desegregation effort, it was very clear that that trust was degrading. SCUR was not only involved in picketing, though, and was involved in electoral work as well. In the early months of 1964, SCUR worked on a Black voter registration drive in East Gainesville that registered thousands. This is important to note because it's actually a duality between this electoral work and the picketing that ended up being and causing a huge division within SCUR. Now, the duality between these two actions, the voter registration drives and the picketing, eventually became an internal sticking point within SCUR and also drew external pressure from different parties within the city. Some wanted to do more picketing and others wanted to really lean into the voter registration drives. There came a couple opportunities where this fracture was kind of highlighted. The Florida Theater, which I believe is still standing if you walk down east on University Avenue, was another segregated businesses that was drawing controversy from local residents at the time because of its refusal to desegregate. SCUR wanted to picket at the Florida Theater, but there's a moderate faction within SCUR that didn't want to. And also the local city government officials that SCUR was working with were pressuring them not to picket because they're afraid that the controversy would hurt their electoral chances. In addition, a radical faction of SCUR wanted to travel to Jacksonville to participate in civil disobedience. Tigert Hall disapproved of this and caused another external pressure for SCUR. And this tension eventually erupted. At a February 21st, 1964 meeting of SCUR, there's allegedly an open war between radicals and moderates over what to do. Moderates carried with 3/4 of the vote, and picketing at the Florida Theater ceased, and the Jacksonville trip never happened. A vote in early March over the same matter went the same way. Jones says, quote, "The internal vision over what to do at the Florida Theater was the end of SCUR. The organization continued to exist on paper for several years, but it held no further meetings and was effectively dissolved. It was dead in the only places that mattered, the minds of the people who had once belonged to it." The lesson of the SCUR story is that organization is crucial but not essential for student movement activity to exist on this campus. And I'll explain more about that during our next story. Even during the decline in momentum of the civil rights movement following the passage of the Civil Rights Act, these students helped pivot the local student movement towards the growing controversy over the Vietnam War, Black Power, and left-wing ideology. However, from the fall of 1964 to the fall of 1965, the student movement entered its first lull. This would be the first of what would become a cycle of activity at UF, with some lulls lasting semesters, others lasting years, and as long as a decade. What separates these lulls from a period of inactivity before the 1960s is ultimately the fact that the people never left. Even when organizations at UF break down, the people don't, and the movement carries on. This matters especially for our next story, which I'll be calling the free speech sequence. And this one will be a little longer, so please bear with me. It's now the spring of 1966, and the students who were once in SCUR have become a formation known as the Gainesville Band. This is an unofficial formation, and I'll be using the term Gainesville Band just to describe them. This was a colloquial term for the students that made up the core of the student movement at the time, and it manifested itself through several official avenues. First, as an activist venue, a little house known as the Freedom Forum, as the student government third party known as the Freedom Party, which campaigned on issues of academic freedom, and a chapter of a nationwide activist organization known as Students for a Democratic Society. It is through the free speech sequence that UF student movement turned from a local civil rights movement to a true protest movement of students fighting on campus for student rights, shifting in a way that would prompt Dr. Jones to call UF the Berkeley of the South. By that spring of 1966, it had become clear that the students of the Gainesville Band, that action was not going to come to them, but rather they had to partly inspire the action themselves. There are a couple problems though. One, the Gainesville Band knew that administration wasn't going to be squarely on their side. Even during the lull, the animosity between Tigert Hall and the band had only increased, especially because of a row over the termination of Ed Richer, a lecturer who was a radical fellow traveler of the band. Two, there were simply no limits at UF during that time. That's to say, UF had no regulations or rules on the books relating to protests or free speech. After all, this was during the waning years of a doctrine called en loco parentis, which established total jurisdiction over students by the university. In fact, it was like the university was the students' parents, simply put. In practice, the Gainesville Band wanted to end en loco parentis by essentially calling the bluff of Tigert Hall on whether they would permit free speech rights on campus. To this end, the Gainesville Band sought to set up a simple confrontation where a student, Lou Cross, would sell copies of the Vietnam Report outside of the library, this library, in fact. The idea was that because administration did have some loose regulation preventing the sale of items on campus, but not specifically political literature, that UF would create regulations around the sale of literature while also enumerating regulations for protests and other forms of political speech in the affirmative. Confrontation was guaranteed for another reason. This particular episode was devised to take place during the student government elections, which Nick Levin, who was running for student body president with Freedom Party, would quickly come to sell copies of the college humor magazine Charlatan beside Cross in his Vietnam report. Without the ability to lean on student government officials to enforce the political line of the university against Cross and Levin due to the neutrality of campaign season, critical time was bought for the tabling outside the library to gain momentum. Jones notes that several other groups, both affiliated with the Gainesville Band and not, came to table or loiter in the area outside the library. The confrontation that Cross and Levin were waiting for did come. The February 1st, 1966 issue of the Alligator, which I believe is pictured on the far right there, showcased this confrontation as it occurred. The first article talks about how Levin and Cross were notified by the Dean of Students, Lester Hale, that they had to submit a petition to Tigert Hall in order to continue their sales. In the same article, the Freedom Forum, remember an expression of the Gainesville Band, postulates that not only was Hale's bureaucratic maneuver, quote, tantamount to the concession of one's constitutional rights, end quote, it is also pointed out in that article that, quote, the ground space in front of the library will continue to be used as a free speech and assembly area. They say you are welcome to Dean Hale and contribute your own views where you're absolutely free to do so. None of us surely would want this community's future determined without the participation of its current decision makers, end quote. As the students expected, Tigert Hall then reacted with a bureaucratic response, not a political one. Cross and Levin, aided by Jones, seized on this opportunity to advance the free speech sequence. UF administration ended up leaning on what they claimed were regulations for 1949, which was in fact a memorandum from then President J. Hillis Miller, which was not only inaccessible to students, but largely unused by administration and found in the back of filing cabinets until 1966. This regulation was also mainly concerned with outside salespeople soliciting on campus and not students soliciting from other students. The second article that ran that day emphasizes the importance of Levin's connections to student government and why it was critical to the success of the free speech sequence. Unable to unilaterally act against a student body presidential candidate, UF President J. Wayne Wrights, pictured on the left, called together a meeting of the student body presidential candidates to decide what to do about Levin's selling of the Charlatan on campus, broadening the question to the sale of literature and magazines by students in general. Although the other student body presidential candidates voted to sanction Levin and by extension Cross for their literature sales, this came to be a victory for the free speech sequence, as the duo would get to create the spectacle they wanted out of whatever happened next. As the Gainesville Band calculated, the hearing would be crucial to advancing the free speech sequence. A few days later, on February 7th, Cross and Levin were brought to the Faculty Disciplinary Committee for their hearings, which by no written down rules were closed and led by ROTC Colonel William Bowes and retired Admiral William Tucker. A column in the Florida Alligator by Marshall Jones, who served as counsel to the students and who had sat in on the hearings, characterized the hearings as, quote, a savage, stupid grilling, wherein, quote, the strongest argument the university gave Cross and Levin was the hearing itself. Proceedings were in the worst tradition of the 17th century, end quote. Although the hearings were closed, Cross, Levin, and Jones seized on the opportunity, of course, to publicize their experiences. In the same column, Jones remarked that until student hearings were reformed, a student may get a hearing, but he does not and cannot get a fair hearing. This was the ultimate folly of administration in this row, because by failing to provide a structured and regulated hearing environment, the Freedom Forum had ample opportunity to use this confrontation to propagandize the hearing in ways that would begin to shine a spotlight on the administration's lack of a stance on free speech. There was no passivity to the actions here. Both the Freedom Forum and Taggart Hall acted antagonistically towards each other in order to reach their respective goals. On the part of the Freedom Forum, of course, the goal was to clarify regulations around free speech and garner solidarity for their growing myriad of causes. On the part of Taggart Hall, the administration likely sought to restrict the growth, what they saw as a radical disruptive movement that emulated the large restless movements that had erupted on campuses like Berkeley over the couple of years prior to 1966. The blunders around the closed hearing and regulations on the part of Taggart Hall led to the second confrontation, the debate. A month after the original hearing for Cross and Levin, on March 16th, an informal group of faculty concerned with student rights, known as the Faculty Study Group, sponsored a panel on student rights. This group, largely remnant of earlier efforts to support SCUR, became activated over Taggart Hall's gross mishandling of the Cross and Levin hearing. In the same article promoting the discussion, the attendees were revealed to be none other than Marshall Jones, Lou Cross, Nick Levin, Dean Hale, and the current student body president at the time who had been elected, Buddy Jacobs, all of whom were directly involved in the prior confrontation. While Jones notes that the momentum going into the debate was on the side of himself, Cross, and Levin, that over the course of the debate, that group spoke less and less as interaction between the audience and Dean Hale carried forward their momentum. A Florida Alligator reported the events documents fiery exchanges between Marshall Jones and Lester Hale, sparring over the vagueness of regulations around student conduct. Jones writes a triumphant, but I will say very searing perspective of the debate that night, noting that, quote, Hale did the bureaucratic thing right out in public. The jargon, the evasion, dumbness, and sick apologetics were all there. All we had to do was sit there and watch while the crowd laughed Hale off stage. It was both hilarious and pathetic. It was also the end of the free speech sequence, end quote. There's no doubt that this was a success for the student movement, and the band subsequently consolidated into a chapter of the Students of Democratic Society in order to fight more effectively on campus. President Wrights, just a month after that debate, would approve the most unrestrictive regulations around protest in UF history in the April of 1966, an unmitigated success for a group that certainly planned to protest much more. After the free speech sequence, UF launched into its most disruptive period of protest in history. I'll show some images here just to give you a sense for the scale of this movement, but unfortunately we'll only have time to dive in on one of several major and important protests which happened at the UF during this time. One quick thing I want to mention, in which Dr. Jones remarks about himself in Berkeley of the South, is that although the free speech sequence was a victory, the regulations it won would be the least stringent in UF history. And over the course of this period of confrontation and escalation, we'd see the regulations tighten over time. This upcoming story will be an example of the push and pull we see with regulation at UF. The year is 1971. Campus is in a state of unrest, with falls being more calm and the springs hosting significant riots, protests, and at a point, even a student strike. Here are some, again, this is an image of a protest that I'll talk about in just a moment. And just to kind of mark how important these protests were, even student government, which then, and for much of its existence after, stuck side by side with administration, joined protesters against the Vietnam War with demands against the lack of Black students, faculty, and administrators at UF. This story will be about the significant protest of 1971, Black Thursday. Although much of the protest action that occurred happened due to the draft and Vietnam War, significant unrest that happened too because of UF's lack of action on bringing Black voices into the university. As early as 1970, Taggart Hall had been made aware of demands around issues specific to Black students on campus, coordinated by the Black Student Union. Demands included more admitted Black students, more Black faculty and advisors, an office for minority affairs, and a Black cultural center on campus. These demands were, of course, supported by the usual allies, Students for a Democratic Society among them, but also by unusual allies for the movement at the time, like student government and specifically student body president Steve Ulfelder. These demands were delivered to O'Connell by BSU in the morning of April 15th, 1971. O'Connell had replaced Wrights a couple years earlier, but O'Connell denied BSU a meeting. Over the course of that morning, several more attempts to meet with O'Connell resulted in suspensions of students and arrests. In response, 1,000 students marched from Plaza of the Americas to Tigert Hall, occupying the building in protest. Here are some more historic images from that protest. In an attempt to regain control, police were sent in. Restrictions were tightened, and several dozen students were arrested, with 66 ultimately suspended from the university that day. This sparked further protest, including an occupation of O'Connell's own lawn later that night. What would become known as Black Thursday caused a national controversy over racial issues at UF, and directly led not only to the establishment of the Institute of Black Culture, but also the Office of Minority Affairs. This was perhaps, beyond the free speech sequence, the most significant victory for the student movement in this era. The role of protests and the alienation between the student movement and administration at this time, though, can't be understated. These demands were, of course, won through the direct action of students as a form of their political participation. Protest, even though, yes, sometimes it can be violent, and even though it is largely condemned by the institutions that it targets, is a popular form of political action specifically because of the way it can pressure targets and win demands through that pressure. It is sometimes a very direct expression of the will of the masses in this way. Now, while the following spring of 1972 saw devastating riots at UF, they are ultimately the last hurrah in a wilting student movement, and by the fall of 1972, the protest movement had largely died down. SDS had disbanded, and a process of reconciliation had started on campus. 1972 was the end of this great period of confrontation and escalation. And many of the groups which once protested in occupied buildings either dissolved or shifted to become multicultural organizations on good standing with the university. This time of decline for the student movement coincided with the new generation of leaders coming into Tigert Hall, with President Marston replacing a polarizing President O'Connell, and Art Sandine rising to become Vice President of Student Affairs later in the decade. The last story I want to tell from this time actually reflects this change and gives a degree of understanding as to why a great lull of activity would follow this period of the 60s and early 70s, but also shows the capacity of the student movement to act in smaller ways as well. This story is about the feminist movement at UF. UF became fully coeducational, that is, it started admitting students fully in 1947. Other researchers have done an excellent job of describing the evolution of women's rights and roles on this campus to the degree that, for those of you who are in person, there's a great exhibit about women at UF just upstairs. My point is that women, since the beginning of the student movement in 1963, were involved in the movement and became radicals right alongside the men they organized with. Women, like Pam Brewer, played an important and intentional role in ending the practice of in loco parentis, but in the follow-up to the free speech sequence. And women helped lead and organize many of the major protests that shook campus from 1967 to 1972. While women did have this impact on the student movement, the changing winds of the 1970s at UF largely chilled any potential for the rise of a true feminist movement within the student movement at UF. A committee on the status of women, for example, formed by Tigert Hall, though largely dealing with staff and faculty, likely preempted the concerns of women students about representation on campus that would have been shared by Black students as well. Remember, similar issues of representation led to Black Thursday in 1971, so it's no understatement that even this committee could have kind of preempted those sorts of radical movements at UF. Feminist organizations like NOW, the National Organization of Women, although campus-based and a campus chapter, are mainly focused on off-campus issues like the construction of a women's center and the passage of the National Equal Rights Amendment. However, UF was not totally devoid of feminist activity. Earlier in 1968, two UF students and organizers with SDS, Judith Brown and Beverly Jones, published a pamphlet known as Toward a Female Liberation, which responded to misogyny within the student movement at the time. Although this pamphlet didn't spur an on-campus feminist movement, it contributed to the development of women's liberation movement across the country. The two students would later go on to found an organization called National Women's Liberation, which still exists today in Gainesville and in New York City. The point of the story, although it has less of a narrative, is that the student movement activity did drop off in 1972 for a variety of reasons. The national political climate was less tense with the end of the Vietnam War. UF's new president, Marston, hailed from a more liberal tradition in UF politics, and issues of feminism and environmentalism failed to galvanize students in the same way the Vietnam War and issues that Black students had did. However, students, as always, did not remain uninvolved, and as they graduated out of UF, they built a robust activist community in Gainesville itself. There were many other protests and events, etc., that happened in the late 1970s to the 2000s that I will unfortunately not be able to cover in this presentation. These events include the rise, fall, and rebirth of gay and lesbian student organizations at UF, the anti-apartheid and South Africa protests and occupations in the 80s, and the Charlie Grabsky lawsuits in the 90s, during which a UF student, Charlie Grabsky, successfully sued Florida Blue Key, an organization that he alleged had deep control over student government after they defamed him. If you have specific questions about these time periods, again, I'll be happy to answer them in the Q&A. What I want to focus on for the rest of this talk, though, is the past 10 or so years of UF student movement history. So let's catch things up to speed. Since 1972, where we left off, students and alumni in Gainesville have consolidated an activist community out of the student movement. The Civic Media Center, which I mentioned at the start of my talk, and where this journey really started, was founded in 1986, celebrated by a speech by Noam Chomsky, a famous left-wing author and linguist. UF alumni and Gainesville community members founded a left-leaning alternative publication in 1992, the Gainesville Aquana, which you can pick up at locations across Gainesville today. And of course, various organizations, such as the Alachua County Labor Coalition, have popped up since the 90s to absorb UF student movement alumni. Although the student movement had garnered this off-campus support since the 1970s, with some exceptions as I described just a moment ago, the student movement was really a shadow of what it had been in the 60s and in the decades since its fall. Especially in the late 2000s and early 2010s, the UF student movement became pushed to the margins, essentially. However, with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, the rise of the alt-right, and growing off-campus movements against police brutality and gun violence, the student movement started to reanimate. Perhaps the crescendo of this initial revival came when in the August of 2017, white nationalist and neo-Nazi Richard Spencer announced he was going to be speaking at UF just days after he helped lead and organize the deadly Charlottesville Unite the Right riots, which resulted in the murder of an anti-fascist protester, drawing national outrage. Although Tigert Hall initially denied Spencer a space for his planned September appearance, citing safety concerns, eventually they were forced to walk back their revocation, and Spencer was slated for an October 19th appearance at the Phillips Center. The student movement, relatively without organization at the time, formed a coalition at the Civic Media Center called No Nazis at UF, with a tagline, quote, "Gators chomp Nazis." Although in all of the other stories we've heard today, the student movement is pitted against administration, this wasn't necessarily the case here. And this is why I wanted to highlight this example. Fast forward a couple months, and with anticipation brewing, President Fox released a statement in October of 2017 that sharply condemned the hateful views of Richard Spencer, but asked students not to give attention to Spencer either by attending his talk or protesting outside. Spencer's visit was reportedly costing the state $500,000 in security, none of which they could bill to the visiting neo-Nazi. Nevertheless, on October 19th, 2017, thousands of students filled the streets outside the Phillips Center, chanting taunts and slogans at the beleaguered white nationalist. His talk, which was similarly flooded with protesters, became an embarrassment. The tensions were high, though, and at a point, it's worth noting that 3 white nationalists shot at the protesting crowd of students, although they were arrested and the protest continued. Although Spencer tried to take ownership of his besieged talk, his reputation would never recover, and following his visit to UF, his series of college campus talks that had made him famous ended. In this instance, even if there was some discordance, the student movement and administration won jointly, and a neo-Nazi of the caliber of Spencer has not been to UF since. Although the student movement at UF was much consistently stronger than it was in previous lulls, there's nevertheless a decline in movement activity coming down from the height of the Richard Spencer protest. In the meantime, though, students formed Inspire Party, an independent party in student government, which came close to winning power from the System Party, which was the kind of Greek party, if you will, in 2019. Students also protested against the lack of nighttime safety in a mass action known as the Blue Lights protest that was mainly organized by non-Greek student government leaders in the same year that Inspire Party came close to clinching power. Various interest groups which spoke off a hub of students, almost like the Gainesville Band of the 60s, enacted various campaigns. The Student Farm Worker Alliance worked to kick Wendy's off campus, while the Food Justice League sought to remove UF's food service provider at the time, Aron, due to connections with prison labor. Students for Justice in Palestine spoke out against what they described as Israeli apartheid in Gaza and the West Bank, while a chapter of the Young Democratic Socialists at UF began operating a Students for Bernie Sanders front in 2019. It goes without saying that even though this could be considered a lull, there is immense activity happening. But ultimately, the scale of UF had grown, and none of these groups garnered even a small fraction of the attention that the Richard Spencer protests and the Gator's Chomp Nazis campaign had. Eventually, though, as we're all familiar with in these kinds of stories that tend closer to our present day, COVID-19 hit and shut down campus in the spring of 2020. UF reopened only partially during the 2020-2021 school year and wouldn't return fully to in-person operations until the fall of 2021. While they failed to galvanize the larger student body, controversies over academic freedom rocked the campus at this time, with complaints lodged at administration by the United Faculty of Florida Union that represents professors at UF. In their small protests, UFF was supported by two revitalized student groups from before COVID-19, the UF College Democrats and a newly reformed chapter of the Young Democratic Socialists of America, YDSA. The rumblings of unrest over academic freedom would set the stage for perhaps the most significant protests of the past decade. While academic freedom was never truly salient as an issue on campus, many students were paying attention to what was happening, especially in the state government, which at the time was passing bills which were dubbed Don't Say Gay, which was part of an initiative to remove what was described as quote unquote wokeness from our schools. These bills raised the consciousness of politics on campus to the extent that the first major post-COVID protest, the March to Protect Queer Youth, erupted over it. However, even this march would pale in comparison to the storm that was about to sweep UF. On October 6, 2022, UF announced that the sole finalist of its months-long presidential search would be Senator Ben Sasse, a Republican senator from Nebraska who had gained national notoriety for his votes to convict Donald Trump during his impeachment trial in 2021. However, Sasse immediately drew ire from the UF student movement and community at large because of his prior stances against gay marriage and limited academic experience at the much smaller and private Midlands University. Immediately, the coalition that had formed meager protests for academic freedom in 2001 was reactivated and called for protests at a series of forums being held by Sasse just 4 days after the announcement on October the 10th. Various posts about the situation by YDSA, Graduate Assistants United, UF College Democrats, and other affiliated groups gained hundreds, sometimes thousands of likes and dozens of reposts in just hours. On that Monday, during the Student Focus Forum being moderated by then Student Body President Lauren LeMasters, hundreds of protesters rallied outside Emerson Hall, just across University Avenue from the football stadium, and they ended up moving their protest inside the building. I'll let the images and headlines speak for themselves. The protest lasted around 3 hours, and as the crowd swelled inside Emerson Hall, the forums broke down, and there's imminent retreat. Pounding on railings and forum room doors, protesters chanted, "Sasse out of our swamp," and "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Ben Sasse has got to go." At a point, the noise was so deafening that even within his forum room, Ben Sasse remarked on how audible the protest chants were, welcoming them as a sign of free expression. Eventually, though, the forum room was evacuated by UF administration, and protesters flooded the very room where Ben Sasse and Lauren LeMasters were holding the student forum just minutes earlier. After occupying the room for some time, students were galvanized by footage of Sasse being shepherded into a cop car after students chased after him, having discovered that Ben Sasse was still in the building in an undisclosed location after they evacuated the forum. The reactions to this protest were instantly polarizing and broadcast across local, state, and national, and even international news media. Student movement leaders celebrated the victory of getting SAS off campus, while administrators, such as President Ken Fox, compared the protests in an Alligator interview to the deadly far-right insurrection at the Capitol, which occurred on January 6, 2021. After the storming of Emerson Hall, many protests at UF has faced a higher police presence, and the regulations of the 60s and 70s that I discussed earlier, long unenforced by administration, are now placed on the doors of Emerson Hall and the student union. Evocations of UF's time as the Berkeley of the South have only become more pronounced in that time since, as the Gaza encampment of April and May 2024 drew students into conflict with administration once more. Students were barred from sitting in lawn chairs or congregating generally on the Plaza of the Americas during that time, leading to a confrontation which resulted in the arrest of several UF students. Protests have been fewer and farther between since SAS resigned the presidency in the summer of 2024, but a stroll through Turlington Plaza or the Plaza of the Americas on the right day would tell you that the student movement is very much alive at UF, just as it has been in other lulls throughout history. Although our history might seem like something we are detached from, I really want to emphasize that the student movement at UF is a living, breathing entity, and what might seem like occasional conflicts between students in Taggart Hall become much more complex when illustrated by the history of student movement activity at UF. This school is exceptional in many ways, and I expect that so long as there are issues for voices to be raised about, that UF students will raise them in ways that challenge the status quo. We live in uncertain times, to say the least, but what I can say for certain is that the student movement continues to make history. And until it stops, we'll continue to be the Berkeley of the South. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very, very much, Aron,